If a person in a position of authority commanded you to inflict agonizing pain on an innocent stranger, would you do it? When psychologist Stanley Milgram posed a version of this question in his infamous 1961 experiments, the results were horrifying. 65% of ordinary participants delivered what they believed was a lethal 450-volt electric shock, simply because the man told them to continue. For decades, the scientific consensus drawn from this data was that human beings possess a built-in vulnerability to authority. Milgram called it the agentic state. The theory argued that when confronted by a superior rank, we temporarily abdicate our free will, operating as mindless instruments for someone else's intentions. Researchers like Leonard Bickman tested the boundaries of this compliance in the field. He had actors approach strangers on the street and issue random orders. When the actor was dressed as a milkman or in ordinary civilian clothes, compliance was predictably low. People simply ignored the requests. But when the exact same actor issued the exact same command while wearing a guard's uniform, obedience spiked. The mere presence of a recognized symbol of societal power seemed to easily override individual discretion. This psychological framework became the standard explanation for the darkest chapters of the 20th century. It provided a clinical rationale for how bureaucratic cogs like Adolf Eichmann could orchestrate genocide. They weren't monsters, the theory suggested. They were victims of an agentic shift, entirely stripped of their autonomy. Modern psychology, however, has begun pulling apart the original data. A closer examination of laboratory transcripts and historical behavior reveals a far more unsettling reality. We do not switch off our brains and blindly obey commands. We actively choose to follow them. To understand why a person chooses to participate in collective violence, we have to look at how we manage existential dread. Terror management theory posits that human beings are uniquely aware of their own inevitable mortality. To keep that paralyzing fear at bay, we construct cultural worldviews and seek out psychological safety by adhering to the standards of our society. When a society experiences severe economic instability or perceives a dire external threat, that baseline anxiety spikes. The cultural shield cracks. In response, individuals desperately look for solid ground, which they find by retreating into a clearly defined, highly cohesive in-group. Societal turbulence forms the toxic triangle's structural foundation. From this unstable base, conformers tolerate bad behavior to survive, while opportunistic colluders actively promote aggression to elevate their own status. At the apex, a charismatic leader absorbs this energy, offering absolute certainty and blaming an external enemy. Historical dictators did not gain control entirely through force. They weaponized their population's desperate need for identity, offering themselves as the sole architects of order. A destructive figure standing alone is impotent. Their power exists entirely because an environment of terror created an audience hungry for an identity, no matter the moral cost of maintaining it. This dynamic forces a complete reevaluation of Stanley Milgram's shock experiments. Recently, psychologists Stephen Reicher and Alexander Haslam conducted a deep dive into the original laboratory transcripts, looking past the top-line numbers. They found a glaring anomaly. When participants hesitated, the experimenter used a sequence of 4 prods. The first 3 were appeals to the importance of the research. Only the 4th prod was a direct, unambiguous order. You have no other choice, you must go on. Every single time that specific order was given, participants refused to continue. People did not shock the victim because they were ordered to. They did it because they were convinced their actions served a noble purpose. Reicher and Haslam call this engaged followership. The participants identified deeply with the scientific enterprise at Yale University and believed their compliance was a virtue. In these high-stakes environments, a process of self-categorization occurs. An individual's personal identity merges completely with the group's prototype. What the person thinks, feels, and does becomes entirely dictated by what benefits the collective. When the individual self dissolves into a collective identity on a national scale, the results are staggering. Tens of thousands of people synchronize their loyalties, operating as a single, unified mass bound by a shared, unquestionable truth. To an engaged follower whose identity is locked to the in-group, harming an outsider does not register as malice. Through the twisted logic of the collective, violence is reframed as a righteous, necessary defense of their own people. The abstract psychology of group cohesion inevitably ends here. Starvation and brutality are the physical manifestations of a system that has successfully convinced ordinary people that dehumanizing their neighbors is a moral obligation. Complicity, then, requires consent. We do not commit atrocities because our agency is stolen from us. We do it because our loyalty has persuaded us that the cruelty is justified. When the architects of these systems were finally brought into courtrooms during the post-war crimes trials, international law had to untangle millions of individual actions from the machinery of the state. The defendants repeatedly deployed a singular phrase, "I was just following orders." It served as both a legal strategy to evade the gallows and a psychological defense mechanism to protect their own minds from the weight of their actions. But when you isolate the individual, stripped of the uniform, and separate it from the intoxicating energy of the crowd, the defense collapses. The burden of choice has always rested on the person pressing the button, signing the paper, or locking the door. The agentic state was an alibi we eagerly accepted because it let humanity off the hook. It is much easier to believe we are helpless victims of authority than to admit we possess a deep, willing capacity for violence. The monster is not an external force waiting to overpower your free will. It is the person staring back in the glass. The true danger lies in our own desperate vulnerability, our profound need to belong, and the lengths we will go to protect that belonging. Resisting a destructive system does not begin with toppling a dictator. It begins with the quiet, terrifying act of standing apart from the crowd. It requires interrogating your own fears and rejecting the comfort of absolute certainty. A toxic leader does not hijack your mind. They simply recognize your deepest anxieties and give your darkest desires for identity a place to call home.